we always start our meetings off with our equity statement and something we call Say This Name, where we read off the names of the individuals who we've lost to gun violence in DC since our last meeting. So we're going to start off with those two things, and then I will introduce our speakers. So here's our equity statement. Our intention is to foster a robust presence of diversity, equity, and inclusion of and for all individuals and groups choosing to join our efforts. Our purpose is to work together to decrease gun violence and increase public safety across our nation. In our meetings, events, and activities, we value diversity, we advance equity, we demonstrate inclusion. We are a community. We are gun violence survivors, including victims and witnesses, change makers, and advocates who come together in partnership to work toward a future that is free from gun violence. And we had a meeting a few weeks ago where we listed off names, and these are the names of the individuals who we've lost since that last meeting. I will ask everyone to unmute themselves. All right, I'll allow participants to unmute themselves. Wait, ready? Let's get started. Just read after me. Jamari Robinson. Dwayne Shorter. Aaron Byrne. Isaiah Glover. Deshaun Watkins. And Sierra Young. And now I'm going to try to mute everybody.
Voy a tratar de poner en silencio a todos, que oímos mucho ruido.
Okay. Okay, sorry about that. Moving right along. All right, our first speaker is Carmen, who is our Twitter team captain, and she's going to talk a little bit about how to use social media to advocate. So take it away, Carmen.
Thanks, Rachel. So if you are not yet on Twitter, please join us. We can add you into the Twitter team. My handle is @CCLodato. I can put that in the chat. You follow me, I follow you, and then I place you into the group so you can see all the awesome things that we're tweeting. But Twitter is super important for Advocacy Day. If you're already on Twitter and maybe you follow some other people in the Moms universe, you see that Twitter is huge on Advocacy Day. You see they're even trending in certain states, and you'll see a bunch of pictures and all kinds of content from all over the country. And also moms in other locations like to amplify when someone else is having an Advocacy Day. So we're going to be tweeting here in DC about ours, and moms around the country are going to be retweeting us and interacting with our tweets to make our reach even farther. So you see here on your screen, tweet it or it didn't happen. We would love to see. I know it doesn't seem as exciting because we're at home, but we want to see you with your coffee mug and wearing your mom shirt in your Zoom meeting with your elected official. So please still take photos and share them. Instagram and Facebook as well, but we're just talking about Twitter right now, and I personally think it's the most important for Advocacy Day. You can see there's some examples here on your screen. See, we've got a mom shirt there, a little like dish towel about organizing phone banking, and she's got her computer on there. And then in the other example on the left, you see a bunch of people on their Zoom meetings. That's how we're doing Advocacy Day these days. So to show that we're still doing our important work, but we're doing it digitally. We've got here, our tone is assertive and respectful. Add hashtags to your tweets to get more reach. Our important ones are DC Ledge and Keep DC Alive, that are DC specific. And then also Moms Are Everywhere. Moms are using that all over the country. I encourage you guys to tag @MomsDemand and @Everytown in your tweets as well. In the chat is our social media toolkit. It has so many example tweets that Sarah and David put together. So if you're looking for you know, you've got your photo and you don't know exactly what to say, there's so many options for you. So you're welcome to use one of those. What else do I have to tell you? I have here written anatomy of a tweet, and I have all these different things I wanted to tell you. For your images, it's important, if you can, to have some sort of mom's branding. So a shirt, or I saw a lot of cute pictures of someone sitting at a computer and it has mom's domain on the back of their shirt, and you can see their Zoom meeting going on. So if you're thinking, oh, I don't want to put my face in this photo, there's lots of creative ways to take a photo that isn't like a selfie of you, if you're worried about that. But if you're already in the Twitter group, we would love for you to send your tweet on Advocacy Day to the Twitter group so we can all retweet each other, because we want to, like I said, expand our reach. So I encourage you guys to join the Twitter team, tweet throughout our week. I guess we don't really have Advocacy Day, we have Advocacy Week. So keep the tweeting going. I'm happy to help anyone get started if they are new to Twitter, and we are going to do an awesome job. The whole country is going to see. Oh, and do not engage with the trolls. Sorry, I didn't mention that. I just straight up block them immediately. Just don't give them the time of day. It's not worth it. And I don't know that you're going to change their mind. They might be too deeply entrenched anyway. So it's not worth it. Just block and keep it moving. That's all I have.
Thank you, Carmen. Straight into the point. Perfect. So the toolkit is in the chat. Please check that out. Our volunteers worked really hard to put together all that sample material, and there's tips in there for Facebook and Instagram as well. Our next speaker is Michael Sean Spence, who works for Everytown. He brings 14 years of experience in public safety to the role of Director of Community Safety Initiatives at Everytown for Gun Safety. And in this role, he oversees Everytown's National City Gun Violence Initiative and works to reduce gun violence and improve community safety through public awareness, technical assistance, and capacity building of community-based organizations and government stakeholders implementing proven evidence-based strategies. And I'm so grateful Michael can join us today. I've been honored to be able to be in meetings with him before, and I know he has a lot of important information to share with us all. I spotlighted you and I'm asking you to unmute, so you should be all set. Let me know. I'll make you a co-host so you can share your screen.
That'd be great. All right, can everyone see that?
Yes.
Perfect, perfect. All right, so one, it's a pleasure to be with all of you. As Rachel mentioned, I've had the opportunity to work with a number of the members of the local chapter in DC, and it has been nothing but a joy. DC is also my second home. It's where I went to law school at Howard. It's where I lived during my undergrad at the University of Maryland, so it's always great to be with all of you. I'm going to share a couple slides with all of you. One, to give you a brief update. As I know many of you are well aware, 2020 was a very deadly year for American cities, including DC. I'll share a little bit of the data on that, how COVID has exacerbated many of the underlying drivers that has impacted the gun violence in DC and elsewhere, how some of our partners have persisted in their work on the ground there, and how that might inform your advocacy on Advocacy Day, March 3rd. It's really exciting to be able to help you guys out with that. So let's just jump in here. As you all know, 2020, deadly year, but a little more about the facts. 57 of the largest US cities reported nearly a 40% increase in gun-related homicides through 2020. And DC grappled with its deadliest year since 2004. By the end of the year, homicides in the district were up 19%, from 166 in 2019 to 198 in 2020, despite overall crime declining by the same rate of 19% during that same period throughout the year. A less discussed component of 2020 is the large number of individuals who have survived shootings. By December, shootings in DC were up 34% to 883 shooting victims. 37 more people survived shootings over the last 2 weeks in DC, for a total of 920. That means 4.6 people were shot for every homicide in DC during 2020. That was also a 64% increase over 2017. So if you look on this graph here, which was from the Washington Post, You'll note that although 2020 was a very deadly year for DC, we also see that those numbers were on the rise, as I mentioned, going back to 2017. And as the majority of cities grappling with city gun violence know, the majority of the victims in DC and cities like it were Black males. 26 of the 198 were women, 9 were homeless. The youngest was an 11-month-old girl who was injured while living at a homeless shelter, and the oldest was an 81-year-old man. And the majority of the shootings occurred in wards 5, 7, and 8, as you see here, pictured on this graph. And while the long-term effects of COVID still aren't clear, a couple things are evident. One, as I just mentioned, the violence was and continues to be concentrated, as you can visibly see here, in communities that have long grappled with inequity, disconnection from opportunity, and are predominantly Black and brown communities. But even before COVID happened, homicides were on the rise in American cities, including in DC. As you see here in the bottom of the slide, this is an article that actually came out in early January, talking about how the 2019 homicide numbers were some of the worst in a decade. At the top of 2020, we were talking about the 4% increase over 2018's homicides, and how it was 43% over 2017, and how it was the highest homicide number since 2008. So as I mentioned, this is an issue that our local moms, that our local partners have been invested in reducing this violence for years. And what happened with COVID was really a lighting of the match. By March 2nd, DC had 25 homicides versus 26 in 2019. What that tells me is, one, we were already on pace to replicate what was happening in 2019, but COVID hadn't really taken its hold yet. And it actually wasn't for another 14 days that DC would see its first stay-at-home order on March 16th. But what we did see is that COVID immediately exacerbated the underlying drivers that was causing the prior uptick in gun violence. And what it did was literally quicken the pace. It did that by disrupting the social services that many of these violence intervention programs rely on to connect at-risk individuals to once they've identified and successfully engaged them, which is critical and long work. But when schools were shuttered, pro-social activities were closed, after-school programs diminished, job training programs were gone, those violence intervention programs could no longer fulfill the promise they made after earning the trust of those individuals. Those programs also met unique challenges. They had difficulty funding their programs, as well as meeting their emerging needs. The vast majority of these violence intervention programs are reliant on government funding that does not provide them the flexibility and discretion to meet emerging needs like buying food and hygiene products, masks and PPE and the like. They also dealt with the same loss of support services I mentioned, but in addition, they had social distancing measures imposed upon them that prevented them from actually delivering many of those services as well. And then they saw an expansion of their mission. In addition to responding to each shooting in their communities, they were asked, as I mentioned, raise awareness about COVID, relying on the earned trust and credibility that they have in those communities, distributing PPE, groceries, providing iPads so that kids could stay connected to schools. And as we always know, every summer, the violence goes up, in large part because schools are closed, pro-social activities are diminished. But as that began earlier in March and April, many of the circumstances that we find in the summer that drives the violence was then simulated earlier. So we saw that summer violence spike in March and in April that we normally see in May, June, and July. And then as we got into May and into the summertime, following the murder of George Floyd and calls for justice from communities across the nation, we saw the already deteriorating trust between police and communities that already impacts response times, willingness to cooperate, or even to call the police when a crime occurs was further eroded. The trust was pretty much dissipated in cities across this nation, and a large part of our work moving forward is rehabilitating that. And then, of course, there was the spike in gun sales, as we're all well aware. As the pandemic raged and gun violence persisted, we saw a record number of sales an estimated 17.4 million sold between March and November alone, an 81% increase over that same period in 2019. And we know that these sales also fuel the trafficking and the flow of firearms into cities like DC, where you have stringent gun laws, but you have enabling neighbors. And with more firearm sales, there are more guns in the homes, which ultimately impact child fatality rates. And it's also been estimated that unintentional shooting deaths of kids increased by 30% nationwide in just the first 3 months of the pandemic. You also see here, as I mentioned earlier, the disproportionate impact on some of the communities in DC. This is early data pulled from DC's Department of Health that reflects that in early May, although Black Americans represent 47% of the population in DC, at that early point, they accounted for 80% of the COVID fatalities. And it was those same communities with disproportionately high COVID infection rates that were similarly grappling with high levels of gun violence. But as always, our allies never stopped. They continued to fight, responding to every shooting, expanding their missions, meeting those demands, helping cities when they called on them, and helping survivors of gun violence, most importantly. By continuing to respond to hospitals, sometimes waiting on the outskirts because they couldn't go in, they ensured that survivors of violence were able to receive the services and the attention that they need. On the bottom left here, you see an image of the Alliance for Concerned Men. They are one of our grantees. I know they're familiar with many. They're supported by Attorney General Racine's office. And our point of contact, Clayton Rosenberg, I will note, actually joined our first grantee call back in July while apologizing for coughing because he had COVID, but insisted on joining us for that call because he was so appreciative of our and the mom's support. In 2020, with our support, they brokered a truce between rival gangs. They went 140 days without a gun incident in Washington Highland. We're talking 3rd, 4th, and 6th Streets in Southeast. They went 90 days without a shooting in Bennington Terrace. They were able to hire a part-time staff that allowed them to implement a mentoring program for the Greenway neighborhood. And they put together a strategic partnership that added more insight to their conflict resolution manual that they provide to all their street outreach workers. In this picture that you see here, they're standing over their sign that got shot down during that house party in August that I know all of you are familiar with, that turned into a mass shooting. It was actually on the property adjacent to the Alliance's headquarters. And on the right is another of our partners that's very familiar with the local chapter, the Trayron Center, frequent partner of ours. And the Trayron Center used our support in 2020 to hire an art therapist full-time to help further their program and expand into 2 additional communities to support youth survivors of gun violence. They also conducted a summer program last summer for 7 weeks, and they're currently running an after-school program through COVID-19 for those who are frontline workers and need the assistance, as we know that many of them are concentrated in these same communities with high infection rates and high gun violence. And then there was another organization that we found the ability to support via partnership with Langeloth, recognizing the increased impact COVID was having. We supported the National Association for the Advancement of Returning Citizens, and they utilized much less funding to provide gift baskets at funerals for DC youth. They also conducted a balloon release for DC survivors where they wrote survivor names on each balloon. So DC continues to grapple with the ripple effects of 2020 and persistent gun violence, but we can be assured that the partnerships we have on the ground will allow us to continue working towards reducing that gun violence. And then lastly, a dire situation demands action. As you're likely aware, the shootings haven't stopped. And in fact, 2021 is already about 20% over 2020 to date. And recognizing the dire situation that many of these violence intervention programs are in, where they have expanded missions, but they have to continue to respond to gun violence, there are a couple steps that we can take. And hopefully Advocacy Day will be just the start of it. But the first is ensuring that Linda Harley Harper, DC's inaugural director of gun violence, and it should say has the resources and support needed to implement the NEAR Act as envisioned. We have to ensure that there's long-term yet flexible funding. That was an emerging need last year that fortunately every town was able to step into the fold and assist folks with, but we know that that's not sustainable. These groups need the opportunity to meet these emerging needs. Additionally, we need to invest in community-based, survivor-centered trauma services. All of you are aware of the Everytown report, A Nation of Survivors. DC is the city of survivors. With almost 1,000 people who were shot last year and survived, plus the almost 200 who lost their lives, and the countless families who are left in their wake, there's a true need for healing, and that healing requires real investment. And lastly, reimagine policing to integrate community-led informed gun violence prevention strategies, group violence intervention being one of them, and also ensure that the recent council measures regarding police accountability and transparency are implemented. These are just starting points that will hopefully rehabilitate some of the trust communities who've been grappling with gun violence can have in the systems that we must rely on to reduce gun violence, while also holding up and really investing in the community-based and led strategies and groups that folks in those communities need to hopefully stop the cycle of violence. I'll take any questions.
Thank you, Michael. If we can hold questions till after Roger speaks, so then we can have a full discussion. Let me do the housekeeping here. Go back to my screen share. Sorry, everybody. Okay. So we have one more speaker, and then we'll definitely have time for some conversation at the end if folks have questions. But I would like to introduce Roger Marmette, who is going to just go more in depth on some of our other policy priorities. Thank you so much, Michael. That was wonderful. And I'm really excited to see, you know, our partners highlighted. Our community partners are doing the hard work out there in the community, making a difference. And so much of our advocacy has to do with elevating and lifting up what they're doing. So thank you for highlighting that. Roger, I want to introduce, he has experienced a loss no one should have to go through, losing his son, Tom, in 2018 to gun violence in DC. And he and his wife have dove into advocacy with literally like no delay and have truly turned their pain into power, working tirelessly in honor of Tom and all the victims and survivors of gun violence. And so I will ask you to unmute Roger and let me know if there's anything else you need me to do on the screen.
I think I'm unmuted. Well, thank you, Michael, and thank you, Rachel, for those really kind words. As every survivor knows, when particularly you have a loved one taken by gun violence, you search for answers. And that search for me in particular focused a lot on DC, where I was born, where Tom was born, and where I have lived most of my adult life. And, you know, Michael spelled out a lot of what has been going on in DC. And we as a chapter, and a lot of you for longer than I have been, you know, shouting from the rooftops about getting a very wealthy city, a very progressive city with a small legislative body to get in, you know, get in shape as far as violence prevention and intervention, like many other cities in the country have done. And as a survivor, you know, in the very beginning, it was figuring out how does this happen? The guy who killed Tom, who wasn't aiming for Tom, if DC had implemented in 2012, 2013, like many other cities, had implemented a robust series of programs The guy who killed Tom would have shown up on social network analysis. He was known to authorities, but he was forgotten. And that's, that's the kind of thing that going forward, I think we all have hopes that with a director of gun violence prevention, with a new deputy mayor who is, I think, very progressive in his thinking about non-policing alternatives to reducing violence. And in particular, DC has joined a network of other cities, violence prevention offices from other cities, and appears to be on the precipice of enacting what has been called for in the toolkits as a comprehensive plan, a framework, using every tool in the toolbox. So there's really great stuff that's been put together by others in that, and all of you can see what's in there. A few things: the NEAR Act, which was put in place in 2016, has not been fully implemented, and parts that are missing could help with funding over the long term rather than on an annual basis trying to scrape together a budget. The other parts that make me hopeful looking forward are we have a new police chief who I think many of us believe is more open to non-policing interventions and prevention for gun violence. A big part, though, will come down to political will. It will really come down to the mayor, who has put some of these pieces in place under pressure. But in every city where this has worked, where dramatic reductions have happened in gun violence, it has involved the mayor buying in, the council buying in, prosecutors and police and community members all being on the same page. And that's just not happened in DC. Things are in silos. We have violence intervention in 2 different offices. We have information not getting to the teams under the Office of the Attorney General. So there's a lot that can be done, and that's what all of our pressure will keep pushing for. The final thought, and this is a new statistic from every town that I think everybody can dial in and find. In addition to the human toll, which so many of us know, there's a huge economic argument. And I don't think we should have to use that argument, but with some council members, this may be what helps, because some of them have been dismissive of violence prevention and intervention. Our city's pathway has been so from the dinosaur ages, when there have been spikes in gun violence, we've flooded the streets with police. Doesn't work. We've gone after the demand, the supply side. Call in your tips. Tell us where the guns are. It's great that they're going after guns, but it has to be both. You have to go after demand. You have to get people to not want to use the gun. And there's a lot of work in that. We can spend a whole other hour going into what each of those preventions and interventions are. But the economic argument is DC spends over $1 billion a year. DC ranks 5th in the US for the cost of gun violence per person. And every town's statistic is that for every resident of DC, gun violence costs $1,551. So that's over $1 billion. Other estimates in other cities have put the direct costs of gun violence, and this is Detroit I'm citing, at 1.6 million per homicide and 1.1 million per injury shooting. So that's about 1.3 billion. If the DC government invested $30 million next year, experts think that that could reduce gun violence by 10% in the first year. And that would be a savings of over 120 million. So by failing to have a comprehensive plan, by not doing everything that's needed and not investing, and this is not building up more city agencies, it's putting more money into the community, into training more alliances of concerned men, into violence prevention and intervention being on every block where it's needed, in every neighborhood where it's needed. The cost of humans is, incalculable, but the economic cost can be calculated. And we are missing an opportunity to show the rest of the country what a city can do when it gets the political will to make a difference. So I'm looking forward to Advocacy Day to share in this community online with all of you, and as a survivor, to do this for my mom and for every other victim. And I'm really grateful to be part of this group of loving and caring individuals. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Roger. And I put in the chat the link to the Everytown research that goes into the economic cost. So we wanted to be mindful of everyone's time and make this a brief overview. We could certainly go much deeper and further into each of these topics, but we did put some more information in the chat and some handouts that we've put together. And all of this is to help prepare us for our week of action, our advocacy week, that we hope everyone will be a part of on March 1st to the 5th. There is a keynote event on March 3rd at noon, and everything is virtual online. And the rest of the week, we're going to be holding meetings with each of the council members, hopefully the mayor, several of the deputy mayors, and other agency heads. And so we really hope to have a strong presence, including our volunteers, survivors, community partners, youth, and really make everyone's voices heard. So I will open it up now for questions and conversation. So I'll just allow people to unmute themselves. You can also put questions in the chat and I can help read them off.
Hi, this is Janine. Can I ask a question?
Go for it.
I was wondering, is this kind of presentation information going to be made at the main event on the 3rd, or is there some minor presentation we're giving at each of the ward meetings where this information will be in their hands and something that they can digest?
This is our training event, and we're recording this so we can share it with folks, and we will send this out to everyone who signs up for those meetings so they can understand ahead of time. We will not be able to go into full detail on these items, but of course we want to get these main points across to our local elected officials. And so we will be sure to bring these main points up in those meetings and try to pressure our local leaders to take action using these tools that we've identified to help prevent gun violence. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I just didn't know if they were getting some version of this, some presentation before we like just went in with QA and however those meetings go. Yeah, thank you.
I've got a question, Rachel.
Sure.
Do we have specific legislation and dollar amounts and things like that that we're going to ask for?
No, we've talked about whether it's legislative or budgetary, and it's mostly budgetary. In terms of specific numbers, we don't have specific numbers, but if you look at the handouts, which I can try to pull up in a minute, a lot of our asks are not necessarily for new budget things, but more to increase the funding for the existing programs. And for things like increasing the funding for the violence interruption programs, Michael, Sean, you can address that if you want. My understanding is that we generally rely on what those groups are asking for their funding. We don't like recommend our own numbers. And then our other asks are things like what Roger talked about undoing the silos and making sure efforts are coordinated, and making sure the new GPP director, Harley Harper, has the power and capacity to be able to coordinate efforts. So it's not really legislative or budgetary. It's more just recommendations on efficacy. Michael, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, that sounds exactly right. As to the funding level, we rely on our partners. The only thing I would definitely recommend we push for is the flexibility, the discretion those groups need. But as to the funding level, they're the experts there.
Yeah, that's a great point. I hear that a lot from our partners about the flexibility, and certainly the COVID has amplified that. Ramaya is asking in the chat, what is the first tangible act we should focus on getting our government to do to receive some results as soon as possible? Michael, what do you think about that?
I think we're on the right track. Violence intervention programs, they're the ones on the front lines responding to this persistent gun violence. They need that support yesterday. So ensuring that they have the proper level and the flexibility to utilize it is critical. The other pieces, as I mentioned, DC being a city of survivors, there needs to be a real investment in healing for the 1,000+ folks who have been impacted directly.
Yeah, Roger, go ahead.
Well, I would say one other thing is to push for, and we can call it, I'll call it reconciliation. I would call for, under the reimagining policing, that the police department needs to build trust with the community. You know, every expert you speak to will say you can't do this with policing alone. And other than the pilot programs and the small scale, too small for the problem, the small scale of violence prevention at hospitals and in a limited number of neighborhoods, DC has been approaching this from mostly a policing strategy. But the police need the community needs the police, but we need the right kind of policing. And everybody talks about a public health approach, and policing needs to be done in a public health minded approach, which means very surgical, very targeted, and focused on the very small number of individuals who are contributing to the majority of the violence in DC. And that hasn't been done as well as it could be. And again, with Chief Conti, I think he gets this, and I think he will work well in an appropriate way with the Office of Violence Prevention. But if the police aren't willing to say, and the mayor aren't willing to say, hey, what we've been doing in DC has not been working. And the numbers, you know, there's no arguing that. It hasn't been working. And so to me, police being honest and saying, we're going to rebuild trust with the community is a key path to reducing gun violence.
Michael, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that's a perfect answer. But I do see another question from Tamar, which I can answer, which is actually very timely because for National Gun Violence Survivors Week, my team pulled together a new fact sheet that you can check out, and I just shared it. It's called Community-Led Services for Survivors, which will give you a couple examples as well as some vignettes of the needs that survivors have and the sort of services that community-based organizations can provide. So that will give you a couple examples.
And for anyone who didn't see, Tamar's question was, are there specific programs or examples of investing in healing? And is this ward specific? And I'll just add for some local context, if people aren't familiar, the Office of Victim Services and Justice Grants gives out a lot of funding. Much of it is victim of crime assistance funding that goes towards that goes to grantees that are community groups that focus on trauma-informed counseling and mental health support. And they did just create their first community-based trauma support center. They were supposed to budget for 3, and then it got cut or reduced. So they were only able to open 1. But we did hear that one has started up and that they've had some support circles, and we've heard from some of our partners that they've been working with that office. So it sounds like that is a good thing that they can hopefully continue to build on. Don asked, which city police department should DC be emulating? Would any of you like to?
I'll say this before we talk about cities. The vast majority of American cities, as I mentioned earlier, are dealing with an uptick in gun violence. No one has solved it, okay? But some folks are doing innovative things. A couple cities I would point you to, obviously, and I think some of you are already aware, Cahoots out of Colorado. They're implementing co-dispatch, where they're sending non-law enforcement personnel with law enforcement to respond to incidents to hopefully reduce use of fire, and it has proven successful in a short period of time. In Los Angeles, I would point you to the GRID program, that's GRYD, which has been informed by one of our grantees, the Urban Peace Institute. And it is a collaborative training and implementation effort with the LAPD and local street outreach workers, where they actually get trained together in the model and how it's implemented. And what they found is that it actually increases the comfort level between law enforcement and these folks that they previously attempted to arrest, many of them, because it does require a change in mindset. But they have been able to do it pretty successfully there. Those would be the only local PDs I would point to in the short term. And to something that was mentioned earlier, Roger mentioned a network of offices of violence prevention. That is something that we at Everytown are exploring how we might support. Right now, there are 20 plus cities, DC being one of them, and they are actually going to be administered by Devone Bogan from Advanced Peace, another known ally, as well as David Muhammad from the National Institute of Criminal Justice Reform. So that's going to be a robust effort, and it should provide some great resources to DC's Office of Violence Prevention as well.
That's great. Katie asked about some of the handouts that we put in the chat. So there's one specifically for social media, and there's a lot of sample tweets there, and some of them have to do with specifically for the week of action, and then others are more like, let's get excited for our week of action that's coming up. So if you want to start using those get excited, let's get involved ones now, you can feel free to. I think we're still like ironing out some of the details on the other ones and getting them picture perfect. So probably hold off on amplifying those on social media, but they're pretty much set. So nothing too much to change. Ramaya asked, what is holding back the mayor and police departments from coming out to show accountability that police reform is not working? I'm not sure how to answer that. I'm not sure how to answer that. Ramaya, what do you think is the answer? Does anyone else want to take that one? We have confirmed a meeting with Chief Conti. I believe it's on Thursday, March 4th at 5 p.m. So as soon as we have all the links for those meetings, we'll send them out. But we hope to get more information from him when we talk to him then. And we're trying to schedule a meeting with the mayor and hope to be able to talk to her more about those things then too. Janine asked, you mentioned we need to push for flexibility. What does that mean? So in terms of flexibility, it means, Michael, you can add, but I think it means that a lot of times the funding that the government gives to our community partners has really stringent requirements and how it can be spent. And it's also, you know, a set amount. It can't be changed. And so like that didn't allow enough flexibility when all of a sudden our partners needed to spend a lot of their money on masks and hand sanitizer or change all of their activities to be over Zoom. They didn't have the flexibility to be able to do that.
That's exactly right. I'll tell you a common obstacle that many of them found was they had budgets that had line items for live events, right? Convenings and sort of things of that nature. And they were not able to utilize those dollars despite not being able to pull them down for actual needs because they are so tied up in that red tape. So allowing them to have the discretion and the flexibility to utilize their current funding as needed is important, but also recognizing that many of them are historically underfunded. So also increasing that funding to appropriate levels is necessary as well.
And hey, Rachel, can I just answer this 30 million? Because
yeah, please.
I didn't really make that up. I'm sort of drawing that figure from Thomas Abt, who a lot of us have been exposed to, who estimated that, and Devone Bogan is someone who I admire a lot, who talks about investing in the core number of individuals who contribute to the vast majority of gun violence. In DC, that number we've heard, and this is, the one's office calls them tier 1 individuals, tier 2, tier 3. They've been called known shooters, would-be shooters, and someday shooters. But we've heard 750 individuals or 1,000 individuals. So I took 1,000 individuals, and the investment of $30,000 in reaching those 1,000 individuals is the $30 million figure. But what's really critical is that nobody dropped the ball in reaching those individuals. And in talking with Linda Harley Harper, she pointed out that the city has dropped a lot of balls because you might have a hospital intervention program where they try to intervene after a shooting, but if they don't follow that and hand that off to a caseworker who will then follow those individuals, and when we go to this idea of social network mapping, the kid who was shot and went to the hospital and lived is then connected to 6 other individuals, and they're connected to another 6. And it's really that the city and more importantly, community-based organizations, and that's part of the flexibility. We don't have a network. Oakland is an example of Oakland Unite, where it's a network of mostly community organizations where the city provides information and resources, but doesn't, it's not a new city agency. So the city needs to focus intensely on those 1,000 individuals. And that's how you get that figure. And yeah, it'd be great if in the first year it could be more than 10% reduction, but that's just a realistic figure while building scale, because the scale isn't there today.
Thank you, Roger. I just want to raise the issue of not only these specific 1,000 people in the violence interrupters, etc., but if we're really looking at a public health model, we have to think about what makes healthy communities, and that involves things like housing stability and children's programs and childcare programs and all of the things that make for equity in DC. We have such extreme inequity here, and it's leading to gun violence. And we're about to get a huge input of federal money. I know 750 some million that we did not get from federal money from pandemic, and I think up to 1.2 billion is going to be coming into DC because of the pandemic. And it seems like we really need to look at how we can start pouring money in towards 5, 7, and 8 resources for families, for teenagers, for children, for babies, for all kinds of things besides just those 1,000 individuals, to make families come up to the level of equity. I mean, I've seen figures that white families have an average wealth of 80 times the wealth of Black families in DC. I mean, this is absolutely criminal. It's, you know, so at some point, somehow moms, we have to start addressing that more. I think also how we can, you know, really advocate for resources to be poured into these communities and into the families if we're really gonna look at public health and prevention. That is my background as a trauma nurse and as a public health person, that we have to create, you know, healthy communities.
Definitely.
It affects COVID, it affects gun violence, it's all interrelated.
It is, and like you said, prevention starts early. The 1,000 individuals that Roger's talking about, these are interventions, really.
And transformation is what Mary Beth is talking about. So it's really prevention, intervention, and transformation, which each have different timetables. And I just caution that there's a false equivalence between let's transform these wards, but you have to do all three of those is I think the important thing. So.
Yeah, I like the way you're talking about that transformation and, you know, to transform and to create equity in DC. Really is something we have to sort of talk about more as, I think, as moms, as we go forward. We cannot continue to do the status quo, and violence interruption programs are fine. And the, you know, the programs to heal trauma, that's all fine, but that's at the tertiary level. If you're talking about healthcare, that's not at primary prevention. That's after the fact, after you've got a bunch of traumatized children and teenagers and families. Yeah, those programs intervene at that level, which is important. We have to do it all at the same time, but we want to also put some money and resources into the prevention before people are traumatized.
I hear you, Mary Beth. I hear you. I agree. Thank you. I want to thank everybody. I want to be mindful of our time and of our interpreters' time. I really appreciate our interpreters working so hard this whole time. And I want to thank our speakers so much. And thank everyone for being on tonight. And I really hope you will all be able to make it to our events during our week of action, March 1st to the 5th. please share the invitation with everyone you know, and be on the lookout for more details about the meetings that we're setting up that we'd really like you to be a part of. Hope everyone has a great evening. Thank you.